Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a real pleasure to get a chance to talk to what's a number of friends. And yeah, and I'll just say it's funny. I just found out yesterday, Steve alluded to it, that I have some funding to do kind of the next project, which I'm really excited about. And so in some ways, this feels like kind of an appropriate time to sort of talk about this. Maybe not one last time, but this does sort of feel like I'm going to be turning my attention to something new, sort of now. And so it's nice to talk about this with some familiar faces. Please, welcome. So I started with this little warm-up activity, like this question: what do you think when you think of character? Do you think of A, B, C, D, or E? Trying to, I guess, as a way of sort of alluding to the fact that I think one of the challenges to character research, like over the last many years, is that and character education for that matter, is that when people think about character education, they literally mean different things, which can sometimes make it hard to have a conversation with folks about effective mechanisms for character development, effective practices for character education, because people are referring to different things when they use that terminology. And so this is just sort of how we're going to. So we're going to sort of start by I'm going to start by just sort of briefly offering like the definition of character that was kind of my working definition going through this study. Talk a little bit about some of the correlations, the correlational research that came out of this study, and then talk a little bit about some of the school practices. So when I say character, like, and all of those, people, if I polled people, like, probably some people would have said A, some people B, some people C, and so on. And of course, like, they're all right, so to speak, right? Like, I mean, it's appropriate for people to have different conceptions of character. For the purposes of this study, when I use the phrase character, I was talking about a set of psychological characteristics that motivate and enable individuals to function as competent and moral agents. And I underline the competent and moral because this sort of really interesting, I'm going to say divide, like, has kind of happened like over the last few years, like maybe always actually, not over the last few years. Like, there's been sort of interesting conversation in the character development world recently, because some people are keenly interested in the moral when they talk about character, and some people are keenly interested in the competence. Like, and there's a little bit of a struggle, I think, like over time happening, in terms of what's going to be our focus, as educators or as educators, given sort of limited time and resources. And I think, like, when you look at a very brief look at kind of public education in the United States, like, you can see that character education has been a part of public education since the beginning. Like the founding fathers of education, like Thomas Jefferson and Horace Mann, made the argument for public education, using sort of like saying that we need this in order to foster the character development of citizens. If we're going to have this democratic country, we need citizens who are actually going to be able to sort of fulfill their civic obligations to this country. And so I think, like, at one point, character, at least in relation to schools, had a very civic focus. And then in the 1970s and 80s, we saw sort of folks like Lawrence Kohlberg, William Bennett, Kevin Ryan, who had very different, like, very different philosophical beliefs about character. But when they said the word character, they were referring to morality, like moral character development. And most recently, like, really sort of happening right now, the energy around character education right now is kind of coming in large part, I would say, not entirely, but in large part, from the educational reform movement, which, for many years was focused on getting low-income kids to college, and has sort of recently turned its attention to through college. Like, it's not enough to get kids to, we've got to get them through, and what are going to be the character strengths that are going to be useful in allowing that to happen. And so recently there's been a real focus on performance character traits. And I forget if I have a word that defines. So, and I guess I'll just say maybe quickly, like, just to offer some definitions. I forget if I have a slide that defines them. When I say performance character traits, like, I'm talking about the character traits that allow an individual to maximize his or her potential in a given endeavor. And that endeavor could be athletic or artistic or academic, right? So when we think about performance character traits, like, by far the most popular terminology we're hearing right now is grit, like perseverance, self-control, optimism, zest. Those are some of the performance character traits we're hearing about. When I say moral character, I'm referring to the character traits that allow an individual to fulfill his or her obligations to another individual or to his or her work. Like, so to fulfill ethical obligations in a particular role. And so I think empathy and integrity are two of the sort of quintessential moral character traits that we think about. Like, what, do you act with integrity in your interactions with other individuals and in your sort of role as a worker? And then when I say civic character, which and none of these, I should say, are airtight, which again leads, I mean, there's, I think that they're distinct spaces, but there are ways in which you can think about overlaps between these three. But when I think about civic character, I think about an individual, the character traits and skills that allow an individual or motivate and enable an individual to fulfill their responsibilities to a particular community. Whether that community is their school community, their local community, their national community, their global community. And so when we think about, sort of a commitment to service, for instance, like, public service motivation, or even sort of, skills like willingness to collaborate, like with fellow citizens, like a respect for diverse opinions, we think about that as civic characters, civic character traits that allow one to be a contributing member of a community. Okay, so I just collected from to try to make the argument, I guess, that there's a lot of interest in character right now. I just collected some pictures from some local, some recent education magazines. And so this is from, I believe this is an advertisement for the KIPP charter schools, but if character counts as much as academics. This is an advertisement for Common Schools, another charter school network. I'm sure many of you have either heard or read Paul Tuff's book, which sort of, I think, brought a lot of interest in grit, like to the surface. This is an excerpt from the KIPP Massachusetts newsletter. And then this is my in-laws live in rural North Carolina. This is the middle school right down the street, and I don't know why it says Perseverance there. And it's kind of funny that school closed, like, is right underneath it. But I felt like maybe it was indicative that this performance character stuff was reaching even rural North Carolina. Okay, so this research study, and I should say that, like, I kind of embarked on this research study just before all this kind of happened. And so it was sort of, I'd like to say that it's like, oh, I saw this, like, sort of wave of interest in character education coming and kind of jumped on, but it actually was sort of by coincidence. And I'm sort of just fortunate to be sort of trailing in the wake of some of the enthusiasm about it. And so I in my career have actually mostly studied civic development. Like, that's been sort of my primary focus, and I'll explain a little bit later, like, how this study kind of happened as a result of that. But I ended up deciding to do this research study focusing on 3 charter schools in the Boston area that are all within 10 miles of each other. They all admit students via randomized lottery. They all are high performing as measured by standardized tests, like you can actually see there. Their students' percentiles of that's the students who scored either advanced or proficient in math and English language arts in the 3 schools, and you can see that they're all just about all in the high 90s. Like, math a little bit lower, but these are way above other schools, and the average for the Boston Public Schools and the average for the state of Massachusetts. So these are high-performing schools, and at all 3 schools, character development is central to their mission, vision, or creed. But what got me interested in looking at these 3 schools is that when they said we focus on character is important to what we do, they actually meant different things by it. It's like one school meant moral character, one school meant performance character, and one school meant civic character. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to see whether kids who sort of go to these schools and are effectively randomly assigned to these schools. Like, it's true that a parent had to sort of indicate, like, oh, I want to assign my student up for this school, but I can attest personally from my own family that there are so few charter seats, like in Massachusetts or in Boston, that most parents actually sort of put their kids into all of the lotteries and just kind of hope that one of them works out. And so it wasn't really the case, and I did do some interviews with parents. It wasn't the case that parents were like, oh, I really like this moral character mission. Let me put, it's parents were actually aware of the sort of the character focus of the schools, but what they cared about was that these were safe schools and schools where kids had a record of going to college. So I thought this would be sort of a useful mechanism comparing, okay, like we have these in some ways highly similar schools, but that conceptualize character in different ways. How do kids come out of these different experiences, or what does it mean to spend a year in these different environments? And so, so let me just say a word about the 3 schools. So one of the schools was the Boston Preparatory Charter School, which was the school focused on moral character development. And Boston Prep, this is their mission statement, the second sentence of their mission statement. An environment structured around scholarship and personal growth cultivates students' virtues of courage, compassion, integrity, perseverance, and respect. And this makes Boston Prep sort of an outlet. So Boston Prep is a no excuses school, sort of part of this movement of charter schools in large part that sort of focus on long hours, strong emphasis on school culture, strict discipline, so on, school uniforms, and so on and so forth. But 3 of these character traits are moral character traits. Compassion, integrity, and respect are sort of, classic moral character traits, which makes Boston Prep a little bit different than many of its other no excuses counterparts, like this focus on moral character. And then we had a school focused on civic character, the Academy of the Pacific Rim Charter School, which is literally around the corner from Boston Prep in Hyde Park. And Academy of the Pacific Rim has these 2 sort of Japanese words that serve as their touchstones. One is gambate, which is all about perseverance, a performance character strength. But the other is kaizen, which is a Japanese principle meaning continual improvement of ourselves and our community. And as I'll sort of get into, you can see in a lot of the practices of Academy of the Pacific Rim a real focus on helping kids think through their responsibilities to the community of APR, to the community of Boston, and to the community and to their roles as global citizens within the world. Like, as you can kind of maybe tell from the unusual name and the unusual logo, the Academy of the Pacific Rim was founded with this idea of merging like the best educational practices of Eastern culture and Western culture, and as a result, there's a real focus on global citizenship. Like, kids have the opportunity to study abroad in China. All the kids in the school study Chinese. Like, they have the opportunity to host a Chinese exchange student, and so there's kind of a lot going on in terms of kids thinking about their roles as citizens in a bunch of different communities. And then the third school that was the school most focused on performance character strengths, which is in some ways like the school probably most sort of aligned with what we're reading a lot about now when we read about grit, is the Roxbury Preparatory Charter School. And they're it's interesting. When I actually started this study, they had like 10 or 11 creeds, that were, they had a lot of different creeds, like some of which were performance character, some which were moral character, some which were civic character. And in my interviews, like, teachers would say, yeah, we really focus on the performance. Like, that's really like, we have this social justice creed, we believe in it, but we don't spend a lot of time on it. And interestingly, like, right after the study finished, unrelated to the study, they actually sort of shrunk their creeds to 4: responsibility, perseverance, community, and scholarship. And I think that perseverance and scholarship are unequivocally performance related, and the way they define responsibility is also kind of in the performance realm. And community, has much more of a civic feel to it. So I mean, I think an important point, right, is that I'm not trying to make the argument that that Boston Prep only cared about moral character, or that Roxbury Prep only cared about performance character. I think all schools and all educators, would say that we care about all 3 of these types of character and cultivating those in our students. But I hope you can kind of see from their mission or vision statements that each school had kind of an emphasis, and that's what I was interested in exploring. Okay, so I did a bunch of different things, like over the course of a year spent in these 3 schools. I gave all of the students in all of the schools surveys in the first week of the school year and effectively the last week of the school year, the last couple weeks of the school year. And I included on that survey previously validated measures of a bunch of character strengths that had been cited by one or more of the schools as a character strength that they were explicitly working on as a core value. And so integrity and empathy were moral character strengths, and actually all 3 schools cited integrity at the time as a character strength they valued. Perseverance and daring were performance character strengths. Perseverance was cited by all 3 schools. And then community and social responsibility were civic character strengths. So I had that survey data across the 3 schools. All 3 schools gave me all of their kids' grade point averages for each term, their demerits. All 3 schools used a demerit system, and I wasn't able to do much with it ultimately because of the way the data skewed. But actually, at the middle school level, all 3 schools actually gave out merits also, which was sort of the positive version of demerits, like when kids were caught doing something good. And then I also did interviews with students, teachers, and parents at all 3 of the schools, and I did, myself and a doctoral student did over 100 observations across the 3 schools of classes, community meetings, advisory periods, extracurricular activities, and so on. And as sort of proof of our diligence, I have this little picture down here. This is a community meeting at Roxbury Prep that was on the school's website, and I realized that I'm standing right there. So I made it into their promotional material. So because I was hanging around so much. Okay, so there were 2 types of analyses that I did over the course of this study: a correlational analysis and a quasi-experimental analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about the correlational analyses first, which didn't actually make it much into the book, but just came out in a paper that I published in Teachers College Record. So the correlational analysis was kind of me trying to get at this idea. So I should say Paul Tough, who wrote this book, How Children Succeed. The working title for years was The Success Equation, which I thought was a really cool title. And then he went in a different direction with it. I assume because it kind of attract parents more, to buy the book. But I kind of like this idea of the success equation, and at least in a tongue-in-cheek way, I was curious to see. I have this grade point average data, I have this conduct data, and I have this character data, and I was curious to see well, let's see which character strengths predict grade point average, which character strengths predict demerits, which is sort of a proxy for misbehavior. And I thought the one thing, and we've seen a fair bit of research from folks like Angela Duckworth, which has found a really high correlation between performance character strengths like discipline, self-discipline, and grit, and academic achievement. But as best I can tell, most of that research hasn't sort of put into the model other types of core character strengths also, right? So it's just sort of said, well, let's see how well IQ and self-discipline predict academic achievement. And it's really important research that's found that self-discipline is oftentimes a stronger predictor of grade point average than IQ. But it was interesting. I was like, well, let's look at a bunch of different types of character strengths and see how they impact a model. So I ran these. I actually initially I ran these things called quantile regression models. I'll just say for folks who are interested, which basically regresses the outcome variable on the median rather than the mean, because a bunch of the outcome variables were not normally distributed. And so anyway, that's about as much as I can effectively say about that. I had to get quite a bit of help from a statistician in relation to that particular analysis. But what this breaks down to, these regression models, where I was basically looking at if I put grade point average as the outcome variable, and I put in all of these character strengths as predictor variables, and I control for the school that you're attending, the grade that you're in, your gender, your race, and so on and so forth, what comes out to be statistically significant. And so when I look at, to sort of bottom line it, my best version of a success equation, and this is purely correlational, is that grade point average was strongly predicted by grade level, that your grades got higher as you got older, and that kind of correlates with some things we know. School connectedness, which is not a character strength, but a quality that I wanted to capture, and that there's a fair bit of research that's found that kids who feel like they're in a caring community do better, and that that was true across the three schools. Perseverance, which kind of aligns with what Angela Duckworth and other people have found, that kids who score high in perseverance also score high in grade point average. Probably most interesting is that integrity was a negative predictor of grade point average in my findings, a significant negative predictor. So meaning the kids who scored high in grade point average were the kids who scored low on commitment to academic integrity. Julie, you have a question?
Can you just remind me the perseverance and integrity, you got those data from interviewing the children?
No, those were pen and paper surveys.
Surveying the children.
Previously validated measures of perseverance.
So to measure what their perseverance was.
Exactly.
Okay.
And self-reported, but on a bunch of different items and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
It's a great question. So that's kind of interesting. It's funny. I reported that finding just a week or two ago to a bunch of folks who study moral development, and they were actually not surprised at all by that finding. I was surprised, because I was a little bit surprised by that finding, and I guess I think that there's a couple different possibilities, right? I mean, it could be that cheating pays off, right? That kids who cheat actually just do better because cheating is an effective strategy. It could be that cheating, that academic integrity measure, is actually just is sort of a proxy for willingness to cheat, and maybe sort of how much you care about your grades. So it's possible that the kids who are willing to cheat are the kids who care more about how they do, and maybe that sort of explains the relationship, and so I've been sort of thinking about that a little bit, and then it's possible, right, that just and I guess thinking about the environments of these three schools, these are three schools that have created an intensive focus on academic success, right, sort of in many ways similar to sort of elite independent schools, right, they've sort of made student success the top priority, and you can see ways in which that plays out, and potentially that does have a negative effect on on commitment to academic integrity in relation to striving, in relation, or kids' willingness to make moral compromises en route to good grades.
Was that regression coefficient pretty stable depending on what you put in the model?
So,
The integrity one?
Yeah,
so like
yeah.
you kind of took out perseverance or
Yeah, absolutely. Like it only gets stronger actually. Because it only gets stronger. It's a good question. So, Marco.
When you found that integrity had a negative, so what was it that you saw, or how could you tell what characterized the lack of integrity? What is it? Is there something else besides cheating that factors into this?
So, do you mean in terms of?
Well, academic integrity, right?
Right.
You
Yes.
said that it had almost like
A negative. It
a
was
negative
a
impact, right?
Yeah.
So that means that students who had higher grades tended to score lower on
this measure.
on measures of academic integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Measures of academic integrity that focused on what?
Oh, they ask kids a bunch of different types of questions. Like, I would be willing to cheat to help out a friend. Like, I would rather get a dishonest C than an honest A. Like, I would cheat if I would cheat if I didn't like my teacher. Like, I would, questions like that. Like, sort of trying to look at situations where, that would push the envelope on kids' willingness to engage in dishonest behavior.
What did the moral development folks you talked to say?
What was their explanation for that?
Yeah.
It's a good. I mean, I think it's a good question.
Or why were they not surprised, did they say?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like I can't I feel like everyone's just sort of nodding their head. Like, I don't actually feel like I can accurately represent their perspective on that just because I was giving the talk. And, but it's a good question.
Just have two quick ones, and then I'll let you go because I'm sure you got other stuff. I'm guessing grade point average, that was like 100%.
Yeah, it's basically, yeah.
And then the other question is, did you have other academic outcome measures? So either standardized achievement scores, probably not, but
I didn't reach out for those. I didn't reach out for the MCAS scores because, in Massachusetts, like, not all kids are tested at all grade levels, and so it would have been, like, oh, I have this for the 8th graders, but this for the 7th graders.
Yeah. And then any sort of academic expectations?
In terms of?
There's an outcome. So, like, so I know social ed folks use a lot of, like, where they see themselves going. So, post-secondary.
That's interesting. No, I didn't have, like, a purpose measure or, like, which is funny, which is something I'm interested in going forward, but I didn't ask anything like that on this. Good question. And then in terms of demerits, I'll just say that, and this is all correlational, right? So I can't really yet offer an explanation of why this is happening. Though I'll sort of try to get into some of that a little bit with the second part of the study. But in terms of demerits, none of the character traits predicted demerits at all, which actually, except for integrity, which surprised me because I would have thought perseverance would, right? Like, I would have thought, the student who sort of showed higher levels of perseverance would be able to kind of hang in there during a boring class, let's say, like, and not, get fidgety and disruptive. But perseverance wasn't, at least the way, like, I was, assessing perseverance didn't significantly predict your receipt of demerits. But integrity did. But this time in the direction that you would like to see, right? Like, the kids with high levels of integrity showed low levels, had the lowest number of demerits. And so interesting, right? Like, academic integrity is still good for something, right? Like, commitment to academic integrity means, correlated with kids who were less likely to be disruptive in class. And I'll just say that. Gender and race, like, so males were more likely to receive demerits than females. Even these schools were 99% students, well, between 90 and 99% students of color. But even within that context, African American students were still disproportionately receiving demerits in comparison to students who identified as other racial ethnicities. And there is, like, a big body of research that's found African American students and African American males in particular to be disproportionately penalized, like, within schools. So that kind of correlated with existing research. So I guess, like, the implications, I think, like, of, and I try, both when I present that research and when I write about that research, I try to be really upfront that those were just correlations, right? Like, I can't say a lot about what was going on to sort of cause those relationships, but I'll just say that I guess what I think is important about those relationships is that it seems to me that both moral and performance character traits are part of the story. And one of the reasons I sort of thought this research might be important would be to try to kind of balance the sort of interest right now in performance character traits. And we know that perseverance was a big predictor of GPA in that model, but it's interesting to see what a moral character trait like integrity is doing. And even, what I wouldn't call a character trait, but something like school connectedness, which is definitely sort of part of the kind of the overall social emotional health of students in a school. And I think that's useful to kind of bear in mind. And I do think it's possible, we don't really know from this data, but it's possible that actually the intense focus on academic achievement is at least maybe in some ways responsible for that negative relationship between academic integrity and grade point average. And so I think that's kind of worth thinking about. It's like, so two of the three schools in the study use this organization this friend of mine runs called the Achievement Network, which basically does interim assessments like for schools to help them kind of get data on how their kids are progressing towards various academic goals in relation to kind of state standardized tests. And also the schools had like rewards for kids who did well on the interim assessments. Like there were these t-shirts that they got to wear called I'm an A-Net All-Star. There were posters for kids who showed big levels of improvement, for kids who scored highest. And and I think that that's in many ways positive, right? But I think that focus on not performance character, but performance, like that focus on sort of the outcome, potentially, could be a motivator to engage in ethically compromising behavior, And so actually, Sarah, coming back to your question, I think one of the people in that room does a lot of research on cheating, and a lot of the research on cheating has found that the most effective way to reduce cheating is to reduce the emphasis on the outcome and increase the emphasis on the process, and potentially at schools that are judged by their performance and standardized tests, there's at least some incentive to focus intensively on the outcome.
And Scott, as a follow-up question, going back to the results that you just shared, those were consistent across all three schools?
So that was all. That was all three schools, exactly. So that wasn't looking at all.
And did you ever look at the schools individually? Did they differ at all?
Well, I'll show you how they differed on the individual character measures in just a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so study number 2. So that was study number 1, where I basically just took and I should say that was sort of the middle school sample, like across the 3 schools. So that was about 600 kids, middle school kids across these 3 schools. Let's just see what's the relationships between these different factors. But then I was kind of interested, but I collected pre-data and post-data on all of those character measures, and I was interested to see if kids at different schools kind of developed differently over the course of the year on these measures. Like, did the kids at the school focused on moral character show greater shifts in their commitment to moral character over the course of the year than the kids at the performance and civic character schools, for instance? And so that was the next thing. That was the next thing I looked at. So I'm sort of gonna. I think I'll probably tell you the stories of 2 of the 3 schools. I'll leave out the performance character school because I think that we sort of get to hear a lot about the performance character right now. So the Boston Preparatory Charter School, which was the school focused on moral character, so there were a couple ways in which they focused on moral character, and this is kind of where the qualitative piece of this study came in. So, and this is actually what my entry point into this whole study was, that I heard that Boston Prep had this ethical philosophy class that all kids in grades 6 through 12 took once a week for their entire high school, middle school and high school career, and that it was a part of the curriculum in the same way that math is and English language arts is and so on. And so I was just really interested by that. I had my previous project had been looking at a community service learning program at Boston College that combined community service and study of philosophy, and I saw some pretty powerful effects of that combination. And so I was kind of interested to see what this middle and high school what effects it was having on middle and high school kids to engage in this philosophical inquiry. And I actually said one of my co-authors from that study is the same back. And so what does ethics class look like? That's what the kids refer to it as, ethics class at Boston Prep. So one of the kind of interesting things about the way ethics class worked at Boston Prep is that it focused on the school's 5 character traits, 5 key character traits, but they sort of scaffolded the learning in the way you would do for any academic subject, so that the sort of learning about a character strength grew more complex with each year. So to take integrity as an example, in the 6th grade, students in ethics class learned that integrity means to tell the truth, and they did readings around this idea of integrity. In the 7th grade, they don't say, okay, it's not that it doesn't, they basically say, now you're 7th graders, you're ready for a more complicated definition of integrity. Integrity means to take responsibility for one's actions. And in 7th grade, they read this excerpt from Gandhi's memoir as part of the integrity unit, where Gandhi talks about stealing a watch from his older brother and then making the decision to confess the theft to his father because he can't live with the guilt of the theft, and kind of how that repaired his relationship with his father. And so the kids do that reading, and they talk about Gandhi's decision, they reflect upon what the meaning of this kind of conception of integrity in their own lives. And then in 8th grade, the definition of integrity gets even more complicated or more complex. They define integrity as to be true to oneself. And I have this picture of Harvey Milk over here, and Harvey Milk was the first openly gay politician in the United States. He was a city supervisor in San Francisco, and it's about Harvey Milk that the students read in 8th grade in relation to this idea of integrity meaning to be true to oneself. And the thinking there, and I sort of sat in on a class where they were talking about Harvey Milk, is kind of that by being open about who he was and being true to himself and his sexuality, Harvey Milk made it easier for other people to be true to themselves, in society. And so I tried to capture a little bit of the conversation that the 8th graders had after reading about Harvey Milk, to kind of just give you a little bit of a sense of what that looked like. So the teacher asked, well, what effect did Harvey Milk's authenticity have on other people? And one student said, well, hopefully a lot of people saw an openly gay man, but half the people hated him. Another student said, I think eventually people realized that they're prejudiced against gay people and that gays can also be human and successful. A third student said, it's kind of like Muhammad and Islam. He had this new idea for a new religion that he thought everyone should follow, and everyone boycotted him. And a fourth student said, Harvey Milk did the same thing as Martin Luther King for gay rights. And the conversation kind of continues on from there. So that's at the middle school level. And maybe I'll kind of say a little bit about the high school level, just to give you a sense of the increasing complexity. And maybe I'll end up deciding to focus on Boston Prep, in the interest of time. So at the high school level, kids are reading pretty serious philosophy. It was way beyond what I should say. And so they had there was a really interesting lesson where kids were still within thinking about integrity, where kids were talking about the social contract. And they had done some reading by Plato and Mill about the social contract, and they sort of applied that reading to two case studies. So one was Muhammad Ali, who made the decision in the 1960s to not fight in the Vietnam War. He said, he was drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, and he said, nope, I'm not fighting in the Vietnam War. I have religious beliefs, I have beliefs about how America has treated African Americans. I'm not fighting. He broke the social contract. And then on the flip side, they read a case study about Pat Tillman, who was a professional football player in the National Football League. And when 9/11 happened in 2001, Pat Tillman quit his job as a cornerback for the Phoenix Cardinals and joined the Army. And so students kind of talked about one case where a student, an athlete had made a decision not to fulfill the social contract. Another athlete had made a decision to fulfill his social contract, or have reached out to fulfill the social contract, and they kind of compared that. And so I'll give you again just a little flavor of what that looks like. So one student said, Pat Tillman decided to let go of his career because he went to war. Muhammad Ali should have partaken in the same social contract. Another student disagreed. Ali didn't have the full power of the social contract behind him. He didn't have every single right that white people did, and they're telling him to go fight for his rights. And this was a much more complicated conversation, so I'm not going to, I'm going to sort of leave it at there. But you can imagine the conversation that unfolds as they kind of make sense of the decisions these two athletes made, and then kind of reflect back on their own role, their own responsibilities or lack thereof to fulfill the social contract as students at Boston Prep, as residents of the city of Boston, as members, citizens of the United States. So when I looked at the integrity score, so all the students at all the schools had taken this measure of integrity that we talked about earlier, and when I looked at the integrity measures and so at the middle school level there were 3 schools. At the high school there were only 2 of the schools at the time of the study had high school grades. Roxbury Prep has now sort of expanded into the high school years, but at the time hadn't. And when I looked at the pre and post scores, I can see that the Boston Prep students scored significantly higher on the post measure than their peers at the other schools, controlling for the pre-scores. So the Boston Prep students maintained higher levels of a commitment to academic integrity over the course of the year, like you'll probably notice that that across all three schools, in most cases, the pre-scores are actually higher than the post-scores. And I don't think that that's because kids became more dishonest over the course of the year. I think that retrospectively, like a measurement problem with this study is that when you ask kids on the first day of school, like how honest are you going to be like in your approach to your work, like it doesn't actually work that, like you get very, very inflated scores because tests haven't been taken, homework assignments have not been assigned. Like I think that, you know, it's funny, I mean, I was trying to sort of do the pre-score as early as possible to sort of get an accurate baseline measure, and I think it actually would have been much more effective to wait a month and a half, like when, you know, so I think that that doesn't, I think that that's kind of worth bearing in mind, but statistically, I was actually controlling for the pre-score. I was looking at like how did kids score on the integrity scale at the end of the year, controlling for where they started from, and you could see that the Boston Prep students scored higher than their counterparts at the other two schools, at both the middle school level and the high school level. And at the high school level, you saw the same thing with the empathy measure as well. Like that the kids at Boston Prep showed higher levels of empathy than their peers at the other high school. And so I guess I'll just say like, oh, and I mentioned that I did interviews with kids at all three schools, with teachers at all three schools, with parents at all three schools. And just in terms of thinking about, well, why? Like, why might this work at Boston Prep have impacted the moral character, the commitment to an academic integrity of kids at Boston Prep how was that functioning if it was? So one 8th grader explained to me that having ethics class kind of reminds people every week about what we're here to do and how we should treat other people. And then a 10th grader, I know this is a lot of text, but I thought it was a great explanation. She said, we're not saying we're complete saints or anything, but if you're going to go with the decision of cheating or not, you're thinking, oh my God, what is this going to affect? You kind of think of everything instead of just doing it and thinking, I don't care. Everyone gets that feeling, and I think it comes from ethics class. Like, and you know, these are just two sort of representatives of themes that kind of emerge in these interviews with students about how they felt like ethics class was impacting the way they made decisions. And I do think that that's a compelling explanation about in terms of thinking about these more quantitative findings. So I'm going to zoom past, in the sake of time, I'm going to zoom in. Well, tell you what, I guess maybe I'll use Roxbury Prep because it's the sharpest contrast to Boston Prep. So Roxbury Prep is the school that probably most aligns with what we think about when we think about grit and perseverance and self-discipline right now. So you can see these are two posters that were hanging at the Roxbury Prep. They have a Reader of the Week. They have a Spirit Stick winner. Like there's a lot of focus on performance, and you can see here a sign kind of wishing kids good luck on the MCAS, which is the state standardized test. It says down here the MCAS is tough, but not as tough as you, and so on and so forth. This is a middle school, and I'll say what Roxbury Prep did to kind of focus on performance character was really interesting. Like Roxbury Prep worked really, really hard to emphasize this idea that effort determines success. Like that the practice you put in to some sort of undertaking is going to pay off in terms of the performance that ultimately results. And there's a lot of different examples of the ways, this was a constant refrain at Roxbury Prep that like effort determines success, practice leads to good performance. Not the most important, but the most amazing to me as an observer was the pie recitation contest. And so March 14th, like Samantha's a math teacher, she knows, March 14th is Pi Day, celebrated by math teachers all over the world. And the way Roxbury Prep celebrated Pi Day was by having a pie recitation contest. Like no student had to participate, but they challenged students, like, if you'd like to memorize as many digits of pi as you can, at our community meeting, like we'll have the winner of the 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade square off in this pie recitation contest. And if you're thinking like there's no way I would ever do that, like as a student, the winner of the pie recitation contest got to pie the principal, like which means throw a pie in the face of the principal, which if you're a middle school student is like the most exciting. When this happened, like the level of excitement in this was unbelievable. I wish I had video. So the students were given opportunities who wanted to participate in the pie recitation contest were given opportunities to practice in their advisory in the weeks leading up to the pie recitation contest. Like they were given some techniques for effective memorization. They were encouraged to practice on their own. On the day of the pie recitation contest, community meeting, all the 6th, 7th, or 8th graders in a room together, 6th grader, 7th grader, 8th grader comes up. The winner of the pi recitation contest recited over 150 digits of pi. It was, and the 6th and 7th graders who came in 2nd and 3rd, like, weren't far behind. Like, I mean, it was a staggering thing to watch, like, I have to say. Like, and I have this sort of moment in the book, like, so the way they'd done it, the students stood there in front of the school community and they put the digits of pi on the screen behind the students so we could follow along, but the student couldn't see it. And I always remember, like, the student, students would kind of memorize them in bursts, so they'd be like 2, 4, 5, 6, and then they would stop and think and keep going. And somewhere around like 130, let's say, the student kind of stops and is thinking, and then goes like 2, 3, and this little 6th grader just like is like, that's right, like, and it was sort of an amazing thing, like, and again, like, I don't think that was the most important example of the way in which Roxbury Prep sort of emphasized this idea of effort determines success, because I'm not sure ultimately how much like memorizing pi buys you in contrast to something like the powerful speaking extravaganza, which was many, many weeks of preparation to perform a piece, like a genre, in front of the entire school community. And I think that buys you a lot in terms of public speaking. But it was sort of just startling in its in how amazing the kids were in terms of their memorization capacities. And so so here's actually so I mentioned the the powerful speaking extravaganza, and I'll just say briefly that kids kind of practiced for that for 7 or 8 weeks in their advisory classes leading up to it. They had to choose a piece, and then in their advisory they had lessons on voice, volume, tone, and so on and so forth. And so here was one of the classes, like right before, one of the advisory sessions right before the powerful speaking extravaganza. So the teacher said, well, what skill do you want to practice today? Like, they kind of finished their new learning, and one student says being louder, another student says when you emphasize words, third student says accuracy, fourth student says eye contact, and the teacher says, today I want you to take one of your areas that is not yet a strength and try to make it one. And one student asked, what happens if you mess up and everyone laughs? Like, this was a 6th grader. And the teacher says, if you do make a mistake, persevere. Everyone wants to support you. It's a fantastic event. Like, and you could see in the advisories the kids kind of helping each other practice, and the 8th graders giving 6th graders a sense of what this experience was going to be like, and so on and so forth. And and actually, so at the powerful speaking extravaganza, the MCs of the event were 2 8th graders, and this is how the male MC started. He said, raise your hand if you're nervous, and 300 hands went up into the air. And he said, it's really good we're here then to overcome that fear. Today's event is not about speaking perfectly, but trying your best and getting better. And a pretty amazing event unfolded where kids were, basically, they had a hat with 6th grade names, a hat with 7th grade names, and a hat with 8th grade names. They picked a name out of a hat. You got riotous applause as you went up to perform your piece. You got riotous applause afterwards, and then 3 judges from the community, who were sort of folks who used public speaking in their professional lives, offered feedback, like, to the students. And then, and the winner got a book of speeches, the powerful speeches that changed the world, and a gourmet dinner with like a friend and teacher. So it was fascinating. And so when okay, since I'm only doing this, since I'm only going to talk about this second school, I'll say this one other thing. So another really interesting place that you saw this sort of focus at Roxbury Prep between effort and success was in the preparation for high school interviews. And so Roxbury Prep at the time only was a middle school, and they really had an explicit goal of having their kids go to very fancy private schools on full scholarships, followed by the exam schools, like Boston Latin School, Boston Latin Academy. And so a lot of effort, in accordance with the school's goal, that belief that effort determines success, a lot of practice went into preparing for the interviews that students were going to do at elite independent schools. And so, to the extent that they actually did mock interviews that were videotaped, and they sort of sat down with the college placement, high school placement person and broke that down, and so on and so forth. And so this was an advisory where the 8th graders were working on mock interviews, and so the teacher had actually done sort of a mock interview where she role-played like some mistakes that a person could make during the course of an interview, and she then asked the kids well, what did you see me do wrong? And so this is what one kid said. She said like every other word. Another kid said she said her favorite subject is gym, which is not very impressive. A third student said she kind of told this whole story about her morning that made her seem pessimistic. Okay, and so I think that gives you a flavor again of the way in which the school really tried to align this idea that the effort you put in an advisory is going to pay off in the performance that you deliver, whether it's at a community meeting, or in your high school interview, or so on and so forth.
How often is advisory?
Once a week. Like, or I should say, it's twice a week. Like once a week is very academically focused, and then the other, like, explicit, like, sort of checking in on your progress report and so on and so forth. And then the other advisory period each week is focused on effectively on practicing for some sort of upcoming performance.
Sorry, how many students in each advisory?
It was about 20. Yeah, about 20. Okay, so when I looked at the perseverance scores, like, again, Roxbury Prep students scored significantly higher than their counterparts at the other two schools, and actually particularly in comparison to the students at Boston Prep, the school focused on moral character development. Again, I had this issue where if you ask kids, like, on the first day of school, like, are you going to do your homework? Like, do you persevere in your homework? I think there's inflated scores. But again, if I look at the post scores and control for, like, where kids started, it was still the case that Roxbury Prep students scored significantly higher than their peers at the other two schools. And I thought, actually, no, I guess I never. Like, so when I asked a teacher, one of the interviews from a teacher, I feel like kind of illuminated, like, what's going on here. And she says, we have our alums come back and speak to parents and students, and they say, I learned discipline while I was here, and I went to high school, and I didn't have to learn that. And I think you can kind of see in even just some of the brief descriptions of the school I've offered, the ways in which the school really worked to help students identify this relationship between effort and success, which is kind of a quintessential focus, a quintessential performance character strength, and setting up perseverance. So I'm actually going to skip past Academy of the Pacific Rim, even though it's a fabulous school focused on civic character. And if you're interested, encourage you to read the book, where I give Academy of the Pacific Rim its due. But maybe I'll just kind of conclude by saying a couple of things. Like, one is that it did seem, from looking at, like, the comparison across the three schools, that different character MCs did lead to different student outcomes. Like, I mean, the kids at Boston Prep did show higher levels of integrity than the kids at Pacific Rim and the kids at Roxbury Prep, and the kids at Roxbury Prep showed higher levels of perseverance than the kids at the other two schools, and so on. But what I actually think is more, like, I actually think the real takeaway from my study is what the three schools had in common. And I'll just say that a lot of my research focuses on identity development. Like, and when we say identity, I mean your sense of self, like your sense of who you are as a person. And we know from lots of research that individuals have a desire to act in ways consistent with their sense of self, right? Like, if you conceptualize yourself as a person who doesn't cheat on tests, then you have a real motivation not to do something that's going to force you to reconceptualize yourself, right? Like, which is actually one of the reasons that, so well, how do you develop a sense of self? Like, how do you come to see yourself as a person who doesn't cheat on tests or does cheat on tests or something like that? And the answer is, teaching and learning. Like, whether it's from your parents, from your teachers, from your siblings, from your community members, it's what you see modeled, and it's what you get explicit instruction in, and it's what you practice, right? And so, I mean, there are lots of different ways of thinking about this. I'm partial to thinking about this in terms of schemas, like that we all have sort of, schemas are sort of cognitive structures for how you act in a particular situation. Like, and I think that word "particular" is important, right? Because when we sort of do surveys of young people and we say, "Are you an honest person? Are you an ethical person?" Like, huge percentages of young people say yes. And then we say, "Have you cheated on a test in the last year?" Huge percentages of the young people say yes. Like, and I think that's because, like, their schema for "Are you an honest person?" doesn't include copying, homework from, literally almost every high school student has copied from a friend in the last year. Like 98% have copied their homework from somebody else in the last year. And that, but that isn't interfering with their conceptualization of themselves as an honest person, because I think that's not part of that schema. And so when we think about sort of what schools, parents, educators can do, it's about building schemas for how it's appropriate, how you act in a particular situation. And I put just the e.g. voting because there's research that's found that if, like, an 18-year-old votes, even if it's literally because someone took them by the hand and dragged them to the poll and threw them in, and they vote, they are much, much more likely to vote for the rest of their lives in presidential elections. And it's because, doing it that first time played a role in establishing a schema of, I'm a person who votes when the presidential election happens. Like, and it's much more likely to kind of continue on that pathway. And so what does this have to do with these three schools? Like, so I chose this picture of a volleyball player setting a volleyball because I think all three schools did something very similar, which is that they provided explicit opportunities for schema building at Boston Prep in that ethics class, where they talked like very explicitly about like what does it mean to be true to yourself, like in Roxbury Prep in terms of thinking about effort determines success. Like I mean those were very explicit places where schema building was happening. But even more importantly, I think, is that those explicit opportunities, like in ethics class and advisory, in Academy of Pacific Rim and character education class and civics class, like they created a common vocabulary across the school. All of the students at Boston Prep knew what the word empathy, like compassion meant, and they knew what the word integrity meant. Likewise, like all of the kids at Roxbury Prep knew what the word perseverance meant, and all the kids in the Academy of Pacific Rim had a real working definition of Kaizen, like this commitment to the continuous improvement in the community. And that meant that like teachers and administrators and parents could use that language dozens of times during the school day to make a point, right? Like when a student at Boston Prep got in trouble and was sent to the dean's office, the conversation was within the context of empathy, integrity, respect, courage, perseverance. When a student at Roxbury Prep was not doing well, that conversation was within the context of our beliefs that effort determines success and so on. And so here's just a couple examples of that. So at a community meeting, the coach of the boys basketball team at Boston Prep stood up after like a big win. I think actually the students had beaten the faculty in the student-faculty game, and the coach said, the virtue I want to talk about today is integrity. One way integrity is practiced is being able to look within yourself and ask the question, am I doing everything I can? And when you have that integrity, success is going to come. And I think there's lots of schools across the country where the coach is standing up and saying something similar, but there's not that many schools where all of the members of that community have actually spent time thinking about what this word means, like reading about how philosophers have conceptualized this word, and reflecting on the role of this word within their own lives. And so that word, that description there, I think, means something at Boston Prep that is often not the case at schools that have worked less hard to establish that common vocabulary. Like likewise at Pacific Rim, that school that was really focused on civic character, which we didn't talk about as much. The principal stood up at a community meeting and said, a North Face jacket we're missing today. Second jacket that we're missing this year, it's obviously not the type of community we want to be. Please bring it back. And again, like there's nothing remarkable about the words itself, but I think that like this is a school that has spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to be a member of a community. Like the 5th and 6th grade character education classes at Pacific Rim are all about that question. Like, what does it mean to be a member of a community? What does it mean to contribute to a community? What are the unique things that I bring to this community, and so on. And I'll just say, what was really interesting at Roxbury Prep, which was the school focused on performance characters, they weren't that good at talking about moral things. Like I actually watched a number of lessons that it didn't go that well. I watched a really poor bullying lesson. Like, the state mandated some talk about bullying, and it did not go well. It went great at Boston Prep because they had this language to talk about it. It didn't go well at Roxbury Prep because they didn't have that moral language. But the places where Roxbury Prep really succeeded in having a moral conversation is where they talked about moral matters within a performance character framework, because that's what they had the language for. And so the year I was at the school was the year that the tsunami happened in Japan. And the school made the decision to fold 1,000 paper cranes because an organization had said they would donate money for every paper crane folded. And that was like the entry point for Roxbury Prep to talk about what had happened with the earthquake. Like there was, later in the year, a couple 8th graders were actually expelled for I couldn't, either selling drugs or just bringing drugs to school. And it was very traumatic for the school. And it was really interesting. Like at a community meeting, 3 8th graders got up and one performed a rap, one read a poem that she had written, and one gave a speech. That was incredibly authentic. And it was incredibly sort of true to that community, because performance was truly the language through which they process things. And they had a language for doing so, and it was interesting to see that. So I guess I'll just finish by saying that I think that though I feel like I was able to sort of point out some differences across the 3 schools and the ways in which those different emphases impacted kids in different ways, I actually think what's most important is that all 3 schools established a common language for talking about important things, and it was a pretty small set of things. I feel like the advice I would give to any school leader is to not have 15 core values. You know what I mean? Like, you know, because I just don't think that's actually feasible to make that a living, breathing part of what the school does. Like, I think, you know, you want 3 to 5, maybe 5. 5 might even be too many. And to figure out ways to implement, like, to make that a part of everything the school is doing. Like, to sort of think through how can these values that we've chosen be integrated into absolutely everything we're doing, and how can we create opportunities to make sure that as a community we know we've spent some time thinking about what these words mean. So that's I think that's my big takeaway from this project. And yeah, and I think I'll leave it at that and just thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night. So thank you very much.